Thermaltake's Core P3 case is probably the most unique chassis to come out of the company in the last few years, and is one that, ironically, others in the industry could stand to learn from. The P3 is a case with flexible uses, including open-air test bench applications, wall-mounted installation, or standard upright mid-tower build formats. Today we're reviewing the Core P3 for build quality, assembly, thermals, and noise as it compares to other cases on the market. Before getting to that, this content is brought to you by v1tech.com, who make the custom backplates shown in our B-roll on the screen of the MSI Gaming X. They've also got plenty of other backplates. You can go to their website and use code GAMERSNEXUS5 for $5 off. Click the link in the description below for more information. So this is the Thermaltake Core P3. It follows up the Core P5, which was a bigger version of this case, and following this one was the Core P1 that we saw at CES, including the Core P1 TG, lots of letters there, and the TG means tempered glass. So there is a tempered glass add-on you can buy for this, but it technically ships with acrylic panels, and the tempered glass add-on is about $37, though the models after this one, including the Core P1 TG, ship with tempered glass as a default configuration. Other than that, this is one of those cases that's part of a new up-and-coming trend of semi-modular design. Cooler Master is a part of this design, where they have their master box and master maker cases and other products in that line, where there's at least some level of appearance of modularity, whether or not they ever expect you to use it. And part of that would be the 3D printing trend. For example, when Cooler Master offers 3D printing capabilities and printouts for a $50 case, because anyone buying a $50 case will have a $2,000 printer. But this one is a bit different. It does have the semi-modular approach, but sticks to a more practical version of that. For some basic examples, there's the PCIe riser cable here. You can configure the video card to either be mounted vertically so that the face is outward. If you want to remove the glass, you could do that, but you face it outward and can position it in any one of the normal PCIe expansion slots, or you flip it and do it horizontally in more of a standard configuration without the riser cable. Other than this, there are options for radiator mounting over here, plenty of drive cage support, all with the SSD logos facing outward, which is just part of the aesthetics thing, and the case has all kinds of open loop support. We test with an air-cooled system for standardization across all of the cases that we review for noise and thermal testing, but this is really best implemented as an open loop case. And other than that, it's got applications as test benches that will go over here, because you could flip it and run it as a standard test bench open air on a flat surface, or run it like this. The only problem is it's a bit big if you go with the horizontal orientation. The Core P3 comes with a lot of loose parts, and it's not immediately obvious what to do with all of them or what order they need to be assembled in. And for that reason, the manual is actually useful here, though it would be nice if they included more Lego-style instructions. This complexity is a direct result of the P3's adaptability. The configuration that we assembled and tested was a normal upright mid-tower, but with the graphics card mounted sideways using the riser cable for display purposes. Alternatively, PCI cards can be inserted directly into the motherboard as usual, with a different arrangement of the expansion slots. Drives can be mounted either inside the case to hide them from view, or in the area meant for the radiator if it's not completely filled, and that offers you the ability to show off the drives. The power supply can be mounted normally or sideways with an ITX board, and there's an optional bracket for a liquid cooling reservoir, which offers an impressive amount of changes right out of the box, but we still have to test noise and thermals, of course. Room for maneuvering is never an issue in a case with no sides, but this also means that it's very difficult to flip the case over or mess with cables until assembly is complete. Putting the feet on after installing the motherboard and standing the case on its side is probably the easiest method. There are also no real cable tie points provided, although there isn't any lack of space to hide the cables in the 5cm wide enclosure. It would just be nice to be able to more easily tie them down to hold them where you want them. Cooling capacity is limited to the radiator mount. This really is a case designed from the bottom up with the intention of liquid cooling, and although air-cooled systems will function perfectly fine, it wastes some of the potential of the case by leaving the one side either empty or filled with 2.5-inch or 3.5-inch drives. There's a magnetic air filter clipped to the case, which may or may not be useless depending on the direction of the airflow, particularly in an air-cooled configuration. And to really make use of this as a good open-air test bench, one of the features we would like to see is optional mounting for fans right up here in the front of the case, so that they can blow inward and get some airflow in there. We use fans like that in our open air benches. For example, if you want the ability to easily swap in and out devices, but also the ability to do some directional airflow for when you're testing things like backplates or passive products or things like that. So some kind of functional mounting bracket up here for 120mm or 140mm spacing would be fantastic for the next iteration, so that you can get some more airflow over the products for people who want to use this in an open air bench setup, because open air test benches are really expensive. If you aren't aware, the benches we buy for testing for our day-to-day component benchmarking and analysis cost about $250 each. They're really good, but they're expensive. This competes with those in a lot of ways. It lacks some of the features like the fan mounting, but it's $93. So that makes it a good competitor for folks who are interested in an open air bench setup. If you're an enthusiast or an overclocker or an up and coming reviewer or something like that, and you don't want to invest $250 in something. The biggest concern with the case after that is stability, since half the case is comprised of non-structural beams and an acrylic or tempered glass sheet, with the rest dedicated to the enclosure. Thermaltake has largely solved for this by just adding more metal to the chassis, making 2mm thick walls when accounting for the paint, 3mm thick steel brackets for wall mounting, and wide legs to prevent tipping. The only supporting structure that fails to perform fully is the PSU bracket, which holds the Corsair RM650 up entirely by one side and didn't quite make contact with the middle. This is more likely because of varying power supply dimensions than Thermaltake's manufacturing, though it would be nice if they could do some kind of implementation that would better fit everything. Moving on into the objective testing, you can check our link in the description below for full testing methodology. Click on that, you can read more about how we do the tests, and also find Patrick Lathan's opinion on this case. He worked with the case the most and wrote the article that's linked below, so you get two dueling opinions there if you're interested in that kind of content. Running the Thermaltake Core P3 through the CPU bench, we see that the open air configuration performs reasonably well overall. The only reason an open air setup wouldn't chart top, as we see here, is because of reduced directional airflow into the components and reduced ability to push warmed air away. In the case of the P3, the acrylic window blocks some of the heat from escaping in a fashion that might occur with a truly open air bench, but not in a way which significantly hinders airflow or performance. With our standardized case testing bench, the Core P3 under a torture workload operates at around 53 Celsius delta T over ambient, with an idle around 3 Celsius delta T. We lose some of the directional airflow and heat exhausting abilities of something like the Silverstone RL06, which is a chart topper for us right now, but still perform well in a semi-open air configuration of the P3. The P3 places just outside test variance margins of the Corsair 270R at 1050 RPM, which tested about 1 degree warmer and within variance of the 270R at 1300 RPM for the P3. The fractal defined C also does reasonably well here, maintaining some level of silence by nature of being an enclosure, but also being somewhat close in temperature readings. Speaking directly to the P3 though, there's nothing really to complain about. Provided adequate active cooling solutions for the CPU and GPU, temperatures will remain in check. Moving to the GPU temperatures, during the same torture workload as the previous test, the Thermaltake Core P3 runs a 52.5 Celsius delta T over ambient GPU value when the fan is configured to 55%, with the idle temperatures hovering around 4.7 Celsius delta T prior to test start. This positions the Thermaltake Core P3 open air configuration about equivalent with the 270R stock configuration at 1050 RPM, similar to the previous test, and within variance range of the Bitphoenix Shogun at 1260 RPM. It's not the coolest box on the chart, it's also not really a full box to be fair, but for a semi-open air configuration with a side panel and no directed airflow from case fans, it's doing pretty damn well. The GPU is at no risk of throttling in this configuration, and a 55% fan speed is representative of the max that most fan curves are willing to go before sacrificing frequency instead of noise. Moving to our 3D Mark Firestrike Extreme workload on loop, we can now look at a realistic thermal scenario with gaming level workloads on both the CPU and GPU simultaneously. This is less intensive than our thermal torture test, but still fairly intensive on some components, while offering a real-world look at how gaming would perform. This is a brand new test and doesn't have any comparative data yet, so Thermaltake is the first to go through the 3D Mark test run. Our next case reviews will add to this and help provide perspective on where things fall. The next test was introduced with our Silverstone RL06 test and will slowly build to add more components. We're using GN's custom Blender animation to render on the CPU here, leveraging only the CPU as a worker. The GPU is running at its minimum fan duty cycle as it is not being loaded at all, and we have fixed the GPU fan speed to this cycle so that it doesn't fluctuate and impact results. With the CPU worker running, we're seeing the Thermaltake Core P3 semi-open configuration operate a CPU load temperature of around 37.3 Celsius delta T over ambient, with its GPU idling at 7 Celsius. The Silverstone RL06 is the only other case on this chart, and it was the coolest case we've recently tested, so it's naturally a high performer. The directed airflow keeps the CPU to around 34.4 Celsius delta T load, with idle around 3.6 Celsius. Both cases are performing well in the sense of overall temperature being well within any reasonable operating range, but we need to continue iterating on case reviews to add more data to this chart. And quoting GN's Patrick Lathan for noise testing, because he really sums it up the best, we see that noise levels were low because of the lack of fans, but also didn't benefit from any insulation. There's a very easy way to judge how loud a radiator with fans will be when installed in this case. Plug it in and listen to it, because that's exactly how loud it will be. If you want more of his take on this case, be sure to check his written article below, but you can see the noise levels here, and it's performing where you'd expect an open air bench with no sound or noise damping to perform. And in that regard, noise levels are going to be entirely dependent on what's in the case. Now, they always are to some extent, but normally you have things like case fans and features of the case that would impact your noise. Here, you don't. So the testing for noise levels really doesn't show you a whole lot other than what our case or our test system noise level is when it's in an open air configuration. So you'll have to buy based on your components in terms of noise, but otherwise, looking at the case overall, eliminating half the panels on the case and going with just this, the structure and an acrylic window, brings cost down. It means that they can get a $93 price point, 90-ish, and that's not bad. The price of the P3 is competitive in this regard. It is priced right around where the Corsair 400C is, the S340 Elite, the Fractal Define C, and all manner of other cases that we've reviewed recently, including the Be Quiet Pure Base 600. None of these cases are quite like this one though. So it's really a weird market where if this is what you want, it's probably exactly what you want, and that's all there is to it. There's not a whole lot of alternatives out there other than open air bench if you want that, or maybe some other small wall mountable PC, but it would likely be smaller than this one. If it's not what you want, there's a whole bunch of options. Again, 400C, S340 Elite, both good cases. Pure Base 600, a good case. RL06, not bad. So plenty of options out there. This is an enthusiast case. It has specific use cases. You probably don't want it configured like this on a table if you have pets, for example, but it would be just fine wall mounted. So pretty unique in that regard and helps out Thermaltake's image, certainly after the last year or so. Other notes here, it's a targeted market. You lose noise insulation and things like that, noise damping more appropriately because it is an open air setup, and you lose directed cooling, but if you buy decent components, it'll be fine. We would like to see Thermaltake expand on this though, and maybe consider the fact that this as an open air bench is very appealing because there aren't a lot of good options out there for under $200. So that's somewhere they could expand more. An 18 by 18 inch square though is a bit rough to fit horizontally, but it's a start. So that's all for this one. As always, you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly. The article is below if you want the full written review. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more. I'll see you all next time. In more of a standard configuration without the riser cable. Other than this, there are options for radiator mounting over here.